So Neil is referring to the fact that I am Linus Torvalds' boss, technically. But as many of you who may know me is, I have a couple of people who work for me, one of which is my 5-year-old daughter, Nisha, who's actually very similar to Linus Torvalds. No, I'm serious. First, they're both adorable. Second, they're both genius, right? They're both geniuses. And then the other trait they share in common is neither of them listen to me at all, really. But this is so terrific. I am so excited to be in a packed room for this project. I feel like a little like my dad. My dad and my grandfather were both in the supercomputing and mainframe industry, and every time I tell my dad about things that we're doing at the Linux Foundation, he says, you know, everything you guys think is cool in Linux, we did 30 years ago on the mainframe, right? And so today I'm becoming my dad. Today I'm going to tell you about how, you know, all these things you're doing, you know, Linux already did a lot of the things that you're doing. But first I'll start by saying everything you are doing is going to fail, unfortunately. I hear this a lot. You know, in fact, I hear this both in my professional life. I've been working with Linux and open source for a long time, and there have been a lot of people who've said we fail. Even worse, I hear it in my personal life. When my wife and I went on our first date, and I told her what I did, I said, you know, I work at this nonprofit called the Linux Foundation. The crestfallen look on her face was just palpable. How are you going to make money? I did end up marrying her, so that speaks to the success of the project, and to the fact that don't believe it. Don't believe when people say something can't be done. And you know, Neela has done a terrific job of pointing out just how well OpenDaylight is doing. And you know, what I'd like to show you is that there's a broader trend going on in the industry that OpenDaylight is a critical part of and probably exemplifies these days better than most that broader trend. And that broader trend is really that open source is becoming the predominant way that technology is being created, period. We've really moved to a new way of collaboration, I think in the networking industry, largely from what was a standard setting driven form of collaboration. That's kind of how companies have worked together traditionally. Networking, obviously required, to really this world where open source is the primary way people are collaborating. I'm going to show you what that looks like. I mean, a world without open source these days is a pretty grim world, right? If you think about it, just think of Linux. If we didn't have open source in Linux, you know, air traffic control systems wouldn't work. 85% of the world's stock exchanges would shut down, right? Most of the internet, Amazon, Google, Facebook, you wouldn't have any friends, right? Facebook would be shut down. It would be horrible. You'd actually have to go to the store to buy books, right? Amazon runs on open source. It would be a crazy place. But not too long ago, people really, with conviction, said this open source stuff is not going to work. And I want to kind of go back, because, you know, Neela said, you know, we've heard a lot of criticisms. When I was trying to get Neela to come work at OpenDaylight, he did hear a lot of people say, you know, it can't be done, it can't be done. And so I thought, let's look back at some of these predictions that people who claim that open source and this form of development wouldn't work, and how those predictions have actually turned out. The first one comes from Bill Gates, right? This is classic. And I know there's plenty of Rajiv and folks from Microsoft in the room. Don't worry, you'll get your fair share here too. We'll make it balanced. But you know, this is back in 2001 when Linux and open source licenses first kind of came on the scene, and Bill Gates, you know, sort of criticized it by describing them as Pac-Man-like. And actually, when I look at this quote, kind of, you know, clearly he's being negative, but honestly, I'm not even sure what he's talking about, Pac-Man-like, right? And I thought about it for a long time. I thought, what is Pac-Man? Pac-Man. Then I finally figured out what this meant. He actually had Bill Gates is a genius, right? He had figured out just what open source was going to look like in the future. And he saw this Pac-Man, right? And here's what it looked like. That's what it looks like. That's exactly what is happening today, right? Craig Mundy also pointed out, you know, he was much softer with his criticism. You this stuff, yeah, for some of this infrastructure stuff, maybe it'll work, but you could never use open source as a model to create anything that would broadly be used by consumers, right? Well, it turns out that that has also been disproven. Not just disproven, but killed, right? Literally, there are 1.5 million devices activated every single day running Linux and open source. It's really changed the consumer. I was at the Consumer Electronics Show, the CES, just a few weeks ago. I went around the show floor, which is, if anyone's been to CES, it's this massive event in Las Vegas, miles to walk around all of the show floor. It was hard for me to find things that were not running on Linux and open source stacks. And that's how dramatic this shift has been. Finally, this is the classic open source criticism that everyone points to, Linux being called a cancer. But even Microsoft, to their credit, who is a participant in OpenDaylight, has even changed their tune. In 2009, Microsoft actually contributed code to the Linux kernel. In 2011, Microsoft actually became a top contributor to the Linux kernel. Microsoft participates in OpenDaylight. Microsoft joined the Open Compute project a week ago. Microsoft is a part of the Apache Software Foundation. So clearly, Microsoft, in all fairness to them, also is a contributor to this great collaborative open source development process that we have, right? And so the question I want to ask to the OpenDaylight project is, this is Linux stuff, and it's easy for me to kind of look back 10 years and, hard to predict the future. But we heard a lot of this same criticism around OpenDaylight when it got started. Same amount, every time we've started, and we've started tons of open source projects at the Linux Foundation. Every time we start one, we hear the same kind of stuff, right? This was some of the things we heard in April when OpenDaylight launched, right? How do fierce competitors get together and compete? This thing's not going to turn out to be anything more than just a failed PR exercise. We heard that there's no way that you could actually do something so complicated with such a firm set of competitors. It would just turn out by like the ATM forum or the network interoperability lines. Now I have to confess, I actually had to Google what the ATM forum was. I think I was in high school when the ATM forum actually started.
ATM's dead. Sorry.
Not quite. Someday ATM may be dead. But clearly these predictions have not turned out to be true. Today, hydrogen is available for download. What a tremendous, give you another round of applause for that. Way to go, guys. As Neela pointed out, over 1 million lines of code, over 150 contributors, multiple products in the market, it is incredible. What's even more interesting to me are that you guys are really getting into these are things that are so far ahead of most open source projects this old already that it's just a tremendous testimony to the project. But what's even better is the things I love hearing that Neela talked about before me, which is you have these really super mature characteristics within OpenDaylight. And let me give you a couple examples. One is developers are associating their careers with the project just as much as with their company. I don't know if you guys noticed that Madhu is a Red Hat employee, but he was previously a Cisco employee. Different companies, still the same role within the project. I think if you talk to any Linux kernel maintainer, it's similar. They both associate themselves with a company, but also with the project itself. And I think many of them would see themselves equally as important parts, that they're important in their lives in both in unique ways. And that's a huge thing. The other thing is we're seeing jobs being created out of this. People who come in as hobbyists and volunteers are quickly hired to become professional developers on the project. Those things only really happen in super mature, really well-established, super high potential projects just like this one. That is a late stage attribute. Not only that, the first summit of the project sold out. Just to put this in contrast, to see, we got standing room only over here. That is tremendous. I thought back, what was the first Linux event like? The same amount of time, less than a year in, after Linus Torvalds had announced Linux to the world, what was the first Linux event like at that exact same amount of time? And this is what it looked like. Torvalds alone in his dorm room drinking. By the way, I have a deal with Linus that whenever I show him shirtless in any presentation, I also have to show a photo of myself without a shirt on. So just full disclosure. But I said, I think some of the folks who've made some of these statements about OpenDaylight, and certainly the folks at Microsoft are here in the room. And when we're predicting the future, and I'm looking back at the past and showing this success, I guess I have to point the spotlight on myself as well, which is, I'm not perfect in some of the predictions that I've made about open source as well, right? There are still challenges in open source. There are still going to be challenges for OpenDaylight. So I thought, in full fairness, the folks from Gartner Group and Network World and Microsoft, I would show several of the predictions that I have made that turned out not quite to be accurate. So this is one, right? But I have a lot of predictions that are bad. Let me show you another prediction that I made that actually turned out not to be right. All right, so I got a couple more. All right. It's going to take me a while to get through these. There was another one. All right. Just for the record, 2014. This is it. This is going to be the year of the Linux desktop, right? But in 20 years, Linux is over 20 years old. Open source as a movement is, now over 2 decades old. We have seen so many predictions about why things are not going to work. Technical problems, usability reasons, you can't make a business around it, there's a legal set of landmines in it, and really, by and large, all of those predictions have turned out to be untrue. And there's an important reason for that. It's because we are on the right side of history. We are on the right side of history in terms of what people want, in terms of creating a better way to innovate, in terms of a better, faster, cheaper way to create products. That the freedom in sharing these ideas through the open source licensing is on the right side of history. No one is going to be able to create anything interesting or meaningful in the tech sector anymore by themselves. You are no longer going to hire the smartest people, lock them in a room, feed them pizza and beer, and hope that they'll come up with some brilliant thing that you'll make a lot of money on. It's not going to happen. You can't do it on your own anymore. And that really is the important thing here. 1.5 million phones every single day activated running Linux. 700,000 televisions are sold every single day running Linux. $1 quadrillion are transacted on just one open source-based system, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. 92% of the world's high-performance computing systems run Linux. 85% of the world's equities trading platforms running on Linux and open source. Most of the internet, most consumer electronic devices. This is clearly working. The pace that this development is happening is unprecedented. Over 1 million lines of code already in OpenDaylight, 150 developers. Look at Linux, which is much older, 10,923 lines of code every single day added to the Linux kernel. 5,500 subtracted every single day. It changes 9 times an hour. How is any single company going to compete with that? And the answer is they're not. 3 million lines of code almost added every single year. It's a $10 billion investment. Companies are simply not choosing to make $10 billion investments on non-differentiating underlying infrastructure on their own anymore. We are on the right side of history. In fact, I think that we will see a new Pareto principle created with open source. I think this is where open source is really going. For people who don't know what the Pareto principle is, it's the 80-20 rule, right? In business, there's the 80-20 rule where 80% of your sales come from 20% of your sales reps. In the computing industry, it's traditionally been 80% of your problems with software come from 20% of the code, right? 20% of the bugs are responsible for 80% of the problems, right? And I think we're going to see this really in open source. In fact, Gartner Group, who was initially critical of OpenDaylight, this comes from them, they're really seeing that on average people are using about 30% of open source in the products and services that they're creating. In the future, really best in class, it'll be 80% of the code will be open source, and then that 20% will be custom code or proprietary code that you'll use to differentiate your product and service. This is where the industry is going, right? Sony is a great example of this, right? 80% of the software in their handsets are open source, right? Really, it is open source that is going to be the primary development model. Now, when I say this to people and say, you have to do this to compete, and proprietary software is just not going to be the way of the future, and closed systems are not going to be successful, everyone says the same thing to me. Jim, what about Apple, right? What about Apple? But even Apple uses, how many people here have an iPhone? You really need to get an Android device. but even Apple has embraced, and Apple's a smart company, they've embraced open source. So if you go in, anyone who has an iPhone, and you go into the iPhone and you look in the general about and legal notices within your iPhone, it's gonna prove my point. Which is what you see in there is, there's the GPL. The GNU General Public License inside of every iPhone and every iPad delivered, right? You'll see Ted Cho, a Linux Foundation fellow, in there. You'll see SUSE Linux listed inside, different components from that project inside of every iPhone, every iPad that Apple says. Because Apple knows the same thing that I've already explained. So nobody's going to create this stuff on their own. The exact same thing is going to happen with OpenDaylight. This is how software is built from now on, I assure you. Open source is not only the way that software is going to be built from now on, it has created an entire genre about how to innovate. How all of us are smarter than any one of us. How no good idea creation can happen in isolation anymore. And it has affected more than just the technology industry, it's affected the mining industry and many other aspects of government and so forth. And that is critically important. The one thing I want you to remember today from me is that OpenDaylight is on the right side of history. And in that vein, I want to just spend 2 more minutes with you and look back at what I think is a great video that was also shown, speaking of Super Bowls, at the Super Bowl back in 2000, that predicted what this future might look like. Let's check it out.
I think you should see this.
It's just a kid.
This is a G chord.
He's learning, absorbing. He's getting smarter every day.
Homo habilis was the first to use tools.
A player who makes the team great is more valuable than a great player. Losing yourself in the group for the good of the group, that's teamwork.
It's happening fast.
We've always watched the stars. If you look at the sky, you can see the beginning of time.
Collecting data is only the first step toward wisdom, but sharing data is the first step toward community.
Poetry. There's not much glory in poetry, only achievement.
Knowledge amplification. What he learns, we all learn. What he knows, we all benefit from.
One little thing can solve an incredibly complex problem.
Everything's about timing, kid.
This is business. Faster, better, cheaper. Constant improvement.
So, you want to fly, huh? Wing speed, thrust, it's physics.
Res publica non domine tuum.
Plummet. It's all about the tools.
Speak your word. Don't back down.
Does he have a name? His name is Linux.
The future is open, and I want to congratulate all of you on being on the right side of history and on your first release. Congratulations. And by the way, does anybody know what happened to that kid from this commercial? Just technical computer history, any trivia question, anybody? This is what happened to him. Thank you very much. Congratulations. You know, Linux already did a lot of the things that you're doing. But first I'll start by saying everything you are doing is going to fail. Unfortunately. I hear this a lot. You know, in fact, I hear this both in my professional life. I've been working with Linux and open source for a long time, and there have been a lot of people who've said we've failed. Even worse, I hear it in my personal life. When my wife All right. So Neil is referring to the fact that I am Linus Torvalds' boss, technically. But as many of you who may know me is, I have a couple of people who work for me, one of which is my 5-year-old daughter, Nisha, who's actually very similar to Linus Torvalds. No, I'm serious. First, they're both adorable. Second, they're both genius, right? They're both geniuses. And then the other trait they share in common is neither of them listen to me at all, really. But this is so terrific. I am so excited to be in a packed room for this project. And I went on our first date and I told her what I did. I said, you know, I work at this nonprofit called the Linux Foundation. The crestfallen look on her face was just palpable. How are you going to make money? I did end up marrying her, so that speaks to the success of the project. And to the fact that don't believe it. Don't believe when people say something. I feel like a little like my dad. My dad and my grandfather were both in the supercomputing and mainframe industry, and every time I tell my dad about things that we're doing at the Linux Foundation, he says, you know, everything you guys think is cool in Linux, we did 30 years ago on the mainframe, right? And so today I'm becoming my dad. Today I'm going to tell you about how, you know, all these things you're doing.